Welcome, everybody. I think a couple more people might be drifting in as we go along. I really want to say thank you to everybody that has arrived, and I see from faces that I've seen at some of the other programs. This is the final program of the neighborhood outreach a series of programs that was supported by a grant awarded to Southampton Open Space Committee, and it's a Department of Conservation and Recreation grant. We're very fortunate to have won this award, and the whole concept is to bring together neighbors, hear topics of conservation interest, and I would say in the time of COVID, this has turned out to be successful. I'm going to say there is a clipboard that's going around. It's on an orange. Thank you, Megan. So if you wouldn't mind, please, everybody sign in on that. A final report of the programs is required, and so I'm starting to draft all of that. I'd also like to say some thanks to people that are here or are not here. There's been donations made to make this successful and to help us stay within budget, including some wonderful bakers. And at this point, I will tell you there's delicious food labeled in the back, brownies, cookies, muffins, and beverage in the ice chest with cups, so please feel free to grab some of those at any point. Excuse me. The church has donated the use of these LED projectors. Easthampton Media is here in their community service capacity doing the recording, and all of these will be seen on the Easthampton Media YouTube site, and it also runs on the, what is it called, the Channel 191 community page, so you can see, apparently they noted that people have been watching them. A neighbor of mine donated the screen, and some of the speakers were able to do this as part of their community service, and we really appreciate that. We are taking some pictures, if it's okay with people, and that's for the report. There will be no posting on social media, just to be sure you know that. I also want to say something about Friends of Southampton Open Space. There are actually 3 organizations that people get a little mixed up about. The Conservation Commission is an important commission in our town, and they are responsible for maintaining our conservation areas and essentially a lot of attention to wetlands. The Open Space Committee, of which I'm the chairperson, my name, Cindy Palmer, is charged by the Select Board to help to identify areas of properties that might be of conservation value, and to help landowners understand their options and choices in terms of what they might want to do with their lands. Every landowner has the right to make their own decisions, but sometimes it's a case of education. And we've had 2 programs specifically to help large tract landowners know about options. We had 2 hikes, and I see some people who are members of the Friends of Southampton Open Space that just arrived. And the 3rd organization I wanted to say is a non-elected 501c3 nonprofit organization called Friends of Southampton Open Space, option to join, and they are really doing a great job forming, and dues are suggested. If you have any questions, the 2 people that came in the back, I think, could answer those, Doric and Josie. Oh, and let's see, they're here. But that's a 3rd organization. Sometimes there's confusion about all these different organizations, and I do get it. I do have some evaluation sheets, and I'm going to pass them around and ask you, and if you need a pen, I've got some pens or writing utensils, and they really have to do with the entire 6-part programs. So I'm really looking for feedback on any part of, if you could, of today or whatever, and we can collect those. I think I've covered all of the major points I wanted to cover, except to say, remember, we are a town meeting form of government, and we have a big town meeting coming on June 12th, and every town meeting is important, and every article on every warrant is important. This one's going to be a big one, and just take the time to find out what's on the warrant. And Southampton residents, if you wouldn't mind, please plan to attend that meeting. It's going to be outside at Labrie Field, so it's COVID safe. And I think that there's a rain date the next day, right? So I know that our town's boards and committees have worked very hard. We have employees in our town, and that's important, but we have an awful lot of volunteers that run programs. Yes?
What time is that?
10 in the mornings. It's a Saturday morning, June 12th, and you'll see more average. Thank you for asking, because like I said, all town meetings are important. And in that regard, the reason for all of this education for all town members is to inform members about what they need to know to make informed decisions at town meeting and other times. So at this point, I'm going to introduce our speaker. I didn't mention that I was going to ask you to speak about your background so that
Okay.
we get it right. But today our speaker is Scott Jackson. He's a UMASS Extension professor. I've heard him speak before, and I was absolutely bowled over by the information that he shared. Once again, if people are not able to attend today, you can send the word out that they can see this on the YouTube site, the whole presentation. And at this point, I think we're kind of covered on that. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Here you go. Buzzy, you got your own.
I got a mic.
Okay.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And thanks for coming out, and thanks for your support for open space protection in Southampton. And thank you, Cindy, for arranging the weather. It's a really pleasure to be here today, especially given that the wind's not blowing and it's not 42 degrees. So I'm Scott Jackson. I work at the University of Massachusetts. I'm a wildlife biologist and a wetland scientist by profession and by training, but I've of late been doing a lot of work on climate change and climate change adaptation. And so that's some of what I'm going to talk about today is some of the issues around climate change and how we go about protecting species and ecosystems, knowing that things are already changing and things will continue to change going into the future. I live in Whately, and in Whately I serve on the Conservation Commission and the Open Space Committee in that town. I'm also on the board of directors of the Kestrel Land Trust, so there might be some questions I could answer about the role of land trusts in doing open space protection in Southampton or other towns in the Connecticut Valley. And I'm going to go through this presentation as efficiently as I can so that you don't get too bored, and then be happy to answer questions at the end. So climate change, I think people are pretty familiar with what it is and why it happens, but simply when the sun's light strikes the Earth, the light can pass unimpeded through the atmosphere. When it strikes the Earth, it's converted, some of that light is converted to heat. And that heat, then some of it radiates out into space, and some of it is kept closer to Earth because of the atmosphere. And so the atmosphere itself works like panes of glass in a greenhouse, in that it allows the light in, but it only allows some of the heat to escape. And so in that way, you're trapping heat close to the Earth, and it's possible that there would be no life on this planet if there wasn't an atmosphere to provide that function. The problem that we're having is that as we take carbon dioxide that's been stored in dead plants for millennia, that in the form of fossil fuels, coal and oil and gas, and we then release that CO2 back into the atmosphere, we change the climate of our planet to be something closer to what it was like back when the dinosaurs roamed the Earth. And so what we've done is we've created an atmosphere with more greenhouse gases that trap the heat, and that results in global warming. So that's one term that we hear about is global warming, and that has to do with the phenomenon of this greenhouse effect. It doesn't mean that the entire globe warms everywhere at the same rate at the same time. You can still have really cold weather even when the globe is warming. The other term that you are probably familiar with is climate change. And essentially, climate change is how our climates change as a result of that global warming. And so the global warming doesn't just increase the temperatures of the planet, but it also can change the amount of energy in the atmosphere. It can change storms. It can change sea levels. There's a variety of other things. So just to review those now, what are the elements of climate change that we are already experiencing and will experience more of going forward? Well, rising temperatures. So that's obvious when you have global warming. And as you warm the ocean waters, the water expands. And so just by virtue of warming the water, it takes up more space and sea levels rise. In addition, when you have rising temperatures, you start to melt the polar ice caps. And the ones in Antarctica contribute more water to the oceans and contribute to sea level rise. Same as the ice cap on Greenland and some of the glaciers around the globe. So in addition to the expansion of water, because it's warmer, we also have additional water going into the ocean that was otherwise locked up as ice. And then the third component of sea level rise that often doesn't get talked about is that the amount of ice on the South Pole is so massive, is so big and so heavy that it actually has a gravitational effect on the waters in the oceans. And so waters in the oceans have been sort of pulled to the south of the globe, and as those ice caps melt, it's going to release those waters to slosh further north. So here in the northern hemisphere, we expect sea level rise to actually be faster because all three elements are coming together to raise the sea levels. Now, when you have a lot more energy in the atmosphere, you're going to have different kinds of weather phenomenon. And so you can expect precipitation to change. In some cases, there are areas of the planet that are going to get drier. Others are going to become wetter. The pattern of precipitation in terms of when you get your rain and snow and how much are likely to change as well. Because of all that energy in the atmosphere, you're going to have more severe storms. That means in number, there'll be more of them, but also in severity, we expect the storms to be more severe than they have been in our history, in our recorded history. We expect acidifications of the oceans, because as you increase carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere, you actually dissolve more CO2 in the ocean water. And when you dissolve CO2 in water, it forms an acid, carbonic acid. And so just because of the increase in CO2 concentrations, we expect increases in acidity in the oceans. And this is no longer hypothetical, because climate change is not just in our future, it's also happening now. And I'm going to just show you some of the data that shows the trends that have been happening. So these are not projections, but actual recorded data about how climate has changed. First is temperature. So you can see average temperature has been increasing in the last few decades. And if you take that and you use a long-term average, and everything that's below average is in blue, everything above average is in red, you can see that all of the recent years, the globe has experienced above average temperatures, and you have to go back in time to get anything that's below that long-term average. And yet people are skeptical sometimes, because weather is variable. It changes, it can be extreme in both directions, either really frigid cold or it can be really hot. And so when you start to think after a hot summer, boy, this climate change, it might be real, then you get a really cold winter and suddenly, where's climate change when you need it, right? And so back in 2014, you might remember the polar vortex, right? This is an unusual weather pattern, which is what makes it so difficult to project what's going to happen in the future. Because we can take past trends and try to extrapolate them going forward in time, but sometimes things just leap into a different direction. And so the polar vortex happened when you had an air mass that forced air to go up to the pole and drop down into North America, and brought all of that polar air right into the midsection of our country, and Canada as well. And so it's because you totally shifted the currents and the direction of weather patterns that you ended up with something really unusual. And rather than being proof that global warming is a hoax, it actually is doing exactly what we would expect, which is shifts in temperature, in weather that are unlike what we've seen in the past. And so the fact that somebody can bring a snowball into the Senate and keep it warm there for a while as they ridicule those who believe in climate change, this is not an unusual thing to have happen. If you look at the global temperatures and the departure from average, from normal temperatures, you can see that Middle of Canada and eastern United States were very cold in January 2014 when this was happening. So yes, it was much colder than average. But look at the rest of the world. Red is above average. So some places are very cold. Look at Alaska and look at Western Canada. They were extremely hot compared to averages. And so when we talk about global warming, we're not talking about everything warming at the same rate at the same time. It's spotty. It's going to be warmer in some places, cooler in others in any given month. But over time, the global temperature has been rising. So the difference between weather and climate is that climate has a lot of variability that makes it hard to detect the pattern. And so here's temperature data from 1850 to 2000 and something. And you can see a little bit of rise, but there's so much noise around that graphic that it's sort of hard to see the pattern. So what we do is we start to take like a running average. So this is a 10-year running average of temperature. This is a 30-year running average. This is a 60-year running average. And as you start to average, you eliminate those fluctuations, you start to see the pattern. And the pattern is increasing temperatures. That's climate. Climate is the averages, the long-term averages, not the day-to-day, month-to-month, week-to-week variation that we call weather. So, how are we doing now? Well, the last data that I could find on the internet, I go to this site whenever I do a talk and I try to grab the most recent data. And so this is from March 2021. And so what was happening in March? It's a little hard to see color on this screen, but it's safe to say it's almost all red, with a few places of pale blue where it was a little cooler than normal. But if you look down here, this is the important thing, is that March 2021 was the 45th consecutive March and the 435th consecutive month with temperatures at least nominally above the 20th century average. So basically, we're on an unbroken streak of above average temperatures. Precipitation changing too. This is what was predicted. This is what we see. Some places are getting drier. In the Northeast, we're getting wetter. If you look at extreme precipitation events, what we call very heavy precipitation, the heaviest 1% of all daily events, in the Northeast, we've had a 71% increase in extreme weather events, extreme precipitation events. So that's just downpours. Not necessarily wind or ice, but just precipitation in general. You wouldn't be surprised to see that that affects ocean temperatures as well. And so you can see that this is the trend that you would have gotten if there was no climate change, just using these data here. But now you can see that the trend is up. And as I said, because you have CO2 concentrations that are going up, so this is CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. This is the percent of carbon dioxide in ocean water. The green line is from Hawaii. The blue line is from Bermuda. So Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean, you see similar trends. This is pH. And again, from Hawaii and from Bermuda, when pH goes down, that means the water's more acidic. So we see a very strong relationship between carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide in the water, and the acidification of ocean waters. I mentioned sea level rise and that we expect in the northern hemisphere to see higher magnitudes of sea level rise. These arrows are showing you how much has already been recorded. So down here in sort of the mid-Atlantic region, we're seeing 1 to 2 feet of sea level rise per century. Over here in our area, it's 0 to 1 foot per century. Those are sort of old projections, and right now, some of the newer projections that I've heard from some of our scientists at UMASS is it could be 10 feet over the next century. It could be much, much worse than we've been thinking up till now. So, what does this mean for us in New England? You know, what kind of changes do we expect to see? Well, warmer temperatures, both in summer and winter. That could yield longer growing seasons, which might sound like a good thing, but if the conditions are drier as a result, you might end up with less productivity in terms of agricultural productivity. We're expecting more rain in the winter and spring, which is not a good thing because that's when we get a lot of rain already and the ground is frozen. So that means more runoff, more flooding, and no crops, no gardens to water during those periods of time. So what about summer and fall during the growing season? We expect less rain. So this opens up the possibility of more droughts, mild droughts, moderate droughts, maybe extreme droughts. We expect less snow, more ice. That makes winters no fun at all for me. But it also has implications for the ecology, and in particular our forests. When there's a good snow cover in the winter, it works as an insulating blanket on the ground, and the frost does not penetrate as deep. And so when you have a deep frost, you can affect the organisms that live in the soil, and you can affect the ability of seeds to germinate. And it could change the pattern of forest regeneration in terms of what tree species will germinate and able to survive their early years, given the deeper frosts we might get if there's not enough snow. We expect more frequent severe storms, and I think you know this is already happening. Storms of greater severity are also likely, which means that some of the severe storms are going to be worse than what we have seen before or that we remember. And then the sea level rise, we're expecting it to be in the 3 to 6 feet range, could be more. Like I said, it could be more like 10 feet. So just looking at temperature data just for Massachusetts, and these are from projections from the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is based at UMASS. It's a USGS science center. And here you can see the pattern for winter temperatures is up. Here you can see the minimum winter temperature during that period is also up. What's interesting about these projections is that when you start to look at, here's the sort of average, but here's just a line that shows you in the historic times that we've lived through, this would be a really warm winter. When you project it out to 2050 and beyond, what we consider a warm winter is going to be the coldest winters that we get. Same thing with the summer. What we consider a hot summer is going to be a typical summer around mid-century or after. This is what we project. There's always uncertainty, and I want to just emphasize this. We're trying to model very complex systems, but scientists all over the globe are cooperating to try to get this right. It doesn't mean that this is right. This is a projection, and it's the best projection we can make right now. It should be enough to get our attention, but we can't necessarily bank on that. The numbers could be very different, could be worse, could be better. We're not sure. Precipitation in Massachusetts has been increasing as well in January to December. Well, invasive plants love CO2. If you increase CO2 in the atmosphere, you're going to favor invasive plants over native plants. So this is based on studies where they put things in a greenhouse, they pump in CO2, and they see which plants thrive and which ones don't. And so these invasive plants have an advantage in terms of size, and they're harder to kill as well. Turns out that New England is a hot spot for future plant invasions. So in terms of new invasive species, we're likely to gain a fair number of those over time. So if we look at something specific like kudzu, which from the south just smothers the landscape. It's an invasive species that takes over and overwhelms everything. Well, here's where the projected spread is. And this is where it's expanded this hatched area due to climate change. So basically, it's projected to spread maybe into Connecticut, but now with climate change, it could go up into Maine. And our old friend poison ivy does really well with high CO2 concentrations. And so they learned about this because they actually have large-scale scientific research projects where they pump CO2 into natural areas to see how it affects the vegetation. And what we're looking at is sort of like growth rates of forests, and what they found is the place got totally taken over with poison ivy. So not only is it more common or more abundant, but it becomes more allergenic in higher CO2 concentrations. So poison ivy is going to be more of a problem in the future than it is now. Some of the pest species that we have to put up with, like deer ticks, are actually set back in the wintertime. So if you have cold weather in the winter, it will kill off a bunch of the ticks, and you'll be able to set back the population levels so that they don't just build from one year into the next, into the next. But as we get less snowfall, we may actually not kill off as many of those ticks, and if we have, warmer temperatures in the winter, we may find that ticks and tick-borne diseases become more of a problem. It's a problem for us. Ticks are also a problem for wildlife. And one of the things that's likely to limit the ability of moose to live in Massachusetts or in southern New England is this tick called the winter tick. And so basically this is a tick that in the fall is out there looking for hosts. They sit on the shrubs and the leaves, and they reach out with their front legs, and when something brushes by, they grab on, and then they embed themselves. And they're particularly feed on moose, where moose occur. And what happens is in the wintertime, those ticks can't survive forever. If they're embedded on a moose, they can survive through the winter. But if they're still on the bush, they'll die or they'll get blown off by the winter winds. But as winter gets set back later and later in the season, it gives longer and longer time for those ticks to infect the moose. And so you get a moose like this. The white hairs are broken hairs because they rub themselves on trees to try to get rid of the ticks. There's so many ticks on them, it drives them crazy. And then they eventually rub to the point where they expose the skin. So you see what are called ghost moose, these sort of whitish moose wandering through the woods. And it's because their hairs have been broken off or their skin is being exposed by all of these ticks. This is what you find on these moose when you see them. So a study, I've got notes here, a study published in a journal I can't read right now in 2018 found that 70% of moose calves in west central Maine and northern New Hampshire died of emaciation by winter tick infestations. 70% of the calves were killed by winter ticks that essentially sucked them dry. On average, each animal hosted 47,371 ticks. So because of some of these changes, seasons are changing. Fall now extends further later into the season. Spring comes earlier. The amount of time of snow cover is shorter. And so you change the season, you can actually change the ecology of our ecosystems, and we can affect the viability of certain species. So we have two species that are native to Massachusetts that typically are brown in the summer and turn white in the winter. So this is the snowshoe hare, and this is the least weasel, or the ermine. And the ermine turns white, the snowshoe hare turns white, so that it's better able to blend in the winter with what's the background of the season, which is white, snow. So what happens when you have a later winter? Do these animals postpone when they turn white? Actually, it turns out it's genetic. They have no way to control it. They turn white at the same time every year, whether there's snowfall or not. And so when an animal like this turns white and there's no snow in the landscape, they show up pretty well to predators. And animals that rely on camouflage to protect them from predation typically don't run away when they're approached, because if you run, you ruin your camouflage. Camouflage doesn't work. So a predator has to get very close before they'll bolt for it. And so the researchers that study snowshoe hares refer to these white bunnies on black backgrounds as light bulbs. When you're out there trying to catch snowshoes, they show up very well. And then when they hold still, when you approach them, you just get out there with a long-handled net and you can just, boom, net them. So the predation effects on these animals are likely to result in population declines. So the ecology can follow the changes in the seasons as well as some of the other changes that we expect from climate change. So now what do we do about it? Well, first thing is we want to try to slow the rate of climate change. We can't stop it. It's sort of like if you build a greenhouse and somebody says it's too hot in there and you say, okay, I'll stop building. It's still hot in there. It still traps heat. So it's not just a matter of stopping building the greenhouse. We have to find a way to try to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But first, let's not add to it. Let's not make it worse. That's called climate mitigation. So those are the efforts that we take to reduce global warming, things like reducing your carbon footprint, having more energy efficient homes, using solar panels, using electric cars. There are a whole variety of things that we are encouraged to do in our everyday lives that can try to slow the rate at which we release these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And then the other thing that we have to do is adaptation, which is how do you cope with climate change? And so when it comes to conservation of our ecosystems and our native species, we certainly want to slow the rate of climate change, but we also have to think about conservation actions that we can take now and in the future that might enhance the ability of certain ecosystems or certain species to persist. And so that's what I'm going to talk about now. Let's talk first about mitigation, because there are a number of things you can do that will mitigate the impact of climate change, but also help with climate adaptation. And land protection is a big one. The extent to which we can protect our forests means that we are protecting a system that absorbs carbon dioxide, turns it into wood, and stores it there for many, many years. And so carbon sequestration is the act of taking CO2 from the atmosphere via photosynthesis and converting it into biomass. Carbon storage is when that biomass stays sort of locked away for long periods of time, and forests do an excellent job of that. And so forest conservation is a strategy for mitigating climate change, but also large tracts of forest land gives us an opportunity to maintain animal populations and plant populations large enough that they can withstand fluctuations, variability, and also setbacks without going extinct. So deforestation is something that we really need to try to get a handle on. In New England, each year, 24,000 acres of forest are converted to some form of development. And 50% of that loss occurs in Massachusetts. So we're still losing forests at a significant rate. And so conserving large forested landscapes is good for slowing down climate change. It's also good for the animals that live there. So, for example, and to try to address the question of, like, when you say large landscapes, how large are we talking about? How much forest do you need for wildlife? Let's talk about black bears. Okay? Black bears have a home range that's highly variable, 6,400 acres to 38,000 acres, depending on conditions. So that, and then the density, bear densities are somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1,400 acres per bear. For bobcats, home ranges 8,000 to 25,000 acres, and density is about one bobcat per 3,200 acres. So in conservation, in wildlife conservation, we have a rule of thumb. We have a couple of rules of thumb about how many animals you need to maintain a stable population. And in the short term, we need an effective population size of anywhere from 50 to 200 or more individuals just to avoid short-term genetic issues or losses due to just random events. And an effective population size isn't all animals. It really only counts adult animals that are available to breed. And it's also discounted for whether there's a skewed sex ratio or whether there's non-random mating. There's a whole bunch of other things that I teach my students at UMASS. But usually, the effective population size is about 30% of the total census of animals out there. So to have an effective population size of 50, you generally need 150 animals to reach that threshold. But for long-term viability, to try to maintain genetic diversity over the long term, we're talking about 500 to 5,000 in terms of our effective population size. Now, look at these densities and calculate in your head how many acres you need to maintain 1,500 bobcats, or how many for 1,500 black bears. So basically, we need a lot of land. It doesn't all have to be in one piece. These animals cross roads, they cross people's backyards, but we can't fragment the landscape to the point where they can't cross it anymore. We need protected areas that cumulatively protect a significant amount of land, and we need to link it together into networks of protected lands that can protect some of our wide-ranging species, but also many of the other species, some of which may be habitat specialists and need particular conditions in order to persist. So how well are we doing, right? Well, here's a map of the Connecticut Valley. I think this is you down here, right? Does that look right? All the green areas are land that's permanently protected as open space. I think we have a little ways to go still. So if we want to maintain a landscape of protected forest, as well as wetlands and streams and bogs and other things, and we want them to stay interconnected, we have to start expanding these and interconnecting them together into networks. And that's the work of open space protection. It's done at the local level by municipalities through their open space committees and sometimes conservation commissions. It's also done with the help of regional land trusts, like the Franklin Land Trust in the northern part of the valley and the Kestrel Land Trust in the central part. But there's still much, much more to do. So now let's talk about climate adaptation. And I show you this picture because this is where a lot of the attention is being paid in climate adaptation. It's like, how do we deal with the fact that these more severe storms that we're experiencing are compromising our infrastructure, our bridges, our roads, and any number of other things that might be damaged due to those severe storms or sea level rise or any of the other elements of climate change. So a lot of times what we say is, you know, we want to create systems that are resilient. But resilient is a general term, and it's not always used in its technical meaning. And so I'm going to tease resilient out a little bit to three different concepts related to coping to climate change. Now, in this case, I would suggest that the highway people don't want a resilient road. They want a resistant road, a road that resists being damaged. Resilient means you bounce back from setbacks. It's like, how fast can you rebuild the road after it's damaged? Or do you have alternative routes that you could take to get to the hospital if that road washes out? Those are all elements of resiliency. But ideally, in a situation like this, you want resistance. You want to make sure that it's not going to wash out to begin with. So the three climate adaptation approaches that we can use, whether it's for human infrastructure, public health, safety, or protecting ecosystems and species, which is what I'm going to focus on today, include resistance. That's avoiding climate-related impacts. So an ecological example of that would be increasing the amount of water that we can store in the upper parts of watersheds so that we can reduce damaging scour due to high flow events, and we can try to avoid having streams dry up during dry periods because there's not sufficient groundwater. So if you store more water in the upper watersheds, you infiltrate it into the aquifer, you create more base flow throughout the season, and you buffer, you don't buffer, you reduce the flooding peaks that you would otherwise get. That's resistance. You're trying to avoid impacts. The second one is resiliency. And resiliency is your ability to recover from climate-related impacts. Again, how do you bounce back from an adverse effect once it happens? An example is to make sure that forests have a diversity of tree ages and species diversity so that if there's some kind of fire damage or storm damage or ice damage, you have, or an infestation of a particular kind of pest or invasive disease or species, that you've got sort of a buffer. You've got a way to spring back for that forest to recover fairly quickly. So maybe a pest might only attack oaks If you have a forest that's only of oaks, it's highly vulnerable. If you have multiple species there, it's going to survive even though there is impact. If you have different age classes in the forest and a windstorm blows down all of the overstory trees, you've got advanced regeneration that can grow up and green up really quickly, holds the soil in place, and over a short period of time starts to provide the shade that's necessary to maintain that favorable forest environment. The third strategy is called transition. And that's where we may feel that there's no way to stop the changes from happening, but we can guide the change in a direction that is more favorable to what we hope to protect. So it may be ecosystem services, it might be particular species, but it means adapting to future conditions. The Nature Conservancy calls this conserving nature's stage, which is don't focus too much on what's on the surface of the land right now, because in 500 years it'll probably be totally different. And we can't predict what it will be. But if we protect areas that are highly diverse in terms of landforms, diverse in terms of elevation, in slopes, in soils, and are interconnected with each other, then whatever lives there is likely to be diverse. And we'll have good biodiversity, even if we can't predict now what's going to be there. So that's thinking about transition. It's not trying to freeze things the way they are now. It's thinking about what's going to be beneficial down the road. Another aspect of this, or another component of this, could be assisted migration, which is where you start to move species around. And the reason why you might want to do that is that we have a number of species that live in our forests, like bloodroot, which are dispersed by ants. So basically, in order for them to move, they're relying on ants to pack their stuff up and move them. And that's a pretty slow way to spread or to shift your distribution. So if you're a bird, or if you're a maple and you have these winged seeds, or if you're a cottonwood and the seeds blow for miles, yeah, you'll keep up with the changes due to climate change. But when you're relying on ants to move your seeds at the pace of climate change, you might need some help. So let's talk about forests in particular. And we'll talk about some of the impacts that we're expecting in forested areas, and we're going to talk about strategies for trying to adapt or try to deal with those impacts. So higher CO2 concentrations might mean increased growth, which many people would say that's a good thing. The longer growing season could also increase the growth of forests, the growth of trees. But heat stress that we get in the winter or the summer could decrease growth. So could drought stress. So we don't really know which way it's going to cut, bigger trees or smaller trees. But some of those stressors could also include vulnerability of fire. So if you're dealing with drier conditions, droughtier conditions, you might have more impacts from fire. You might get more mortality in general. You could get changes in species composition. So those sugar bushes that we rely on for maple sap to make maple sugar, maple syrup, those could turn into something else. They could be oak hickory forests in a couple hundred years. Depth to the frost line I talked about. This is sort of a big question mark. We're not exactly sure what to expect. Probably increase in damage in our forests due to severe weather events like tornadoes and microbursts, ice storms, and increased threats from diseases and pests that are going to move into our area from further south. So just to talk a little bit about species shifts, I talked about sugar maple. Here's the current distribution of sugar maple in terms of the favorability of conditions. So the areas in blue are highly favorable. There's only a few in here. Green is very good. When you get to yellow or white, that's where you're not expected to see much sugar maple. So this is current conditions. This is projected future conditions. So you can see that the sugar maples are going to, the distribution is going to shrink and it's going to shift further north. Another one, eastern hemlock. Here's the current situation, the current distribution. This is estimated future distribution. Again, the conditions are not as favorable and it shrinks in terms of its geographic distribution. There are also wildlife species that depend on hemlock. So black-throated green warbler is a common warbler that breeds here in Massachusetts, in western Mass. And here's the model for where the habitat is most suitable for that species. Again, the blue is great, the green is good, and the yellow is not so good. This is the projection for the future. So we're looking at a future where, reflecting the loss in hemlock, we see a loss of species that are dependent on hemlock, like the black-throated green warbler. And as you probably know, the hemlocks are already under assault from an invasive insect, the hemlock woolly adelgid. And this is a species that in the southern part of the hemlock's range pretty much kills all of the individual hemlock trees in that area. And so in Connecticut, they've had some pretty severe damage due to that. But in Massachusetts, it hasn't been quite so bad. And that's because as you go north, you hit critical temperatures. 28.8 degrees centigrade is a critical temperature where if you have the right number of days below that temperature, you're going to kill back the adelgid. So the current is in gray, and you can see that a large part of where we are has temperatures that are favorable for trying to control the adelgid so that it's here, but it doesn't necessarily kill the hemlocks, or it doesn't kill them all. But when we project forward in time, that's where we get to this red area. And the red area are the only areas that are likely to be able to control the adelgid as temperatures increase and as winters become shorter. So there's another stress on our forests. So an important concept in terms of how do you protect ecosystems with all of this bad news. And I know you're all looking so glum. I'm really sorry to have done this to you. You got to shake you up first, and then we rally, right, to do something good, to do something important. And so one important concept is this idea of refugia. So refugia are areas that remain even though conditions otherwise have shifted. So areas that maintain relatively buffered from climate change over time that enable the persistence of certain valued conditions or ecosystems or species. And so sometimes we say, okay, we really value our northern hardwood forests. Those are our beech, birch, maple, basswood forests. Maybe there are certain areas that are going to survive longer than others. If we can identify those areas, then those should be priorities for land conservation so that we can try to maintain those ecosystems into the future, even while in other areas we may not be able to do that. It's going to shift whether we want it to or not. So when we think from a forest point of view, we have these different strategies: resistance, resilience, and transition. And so as you get farther out this way, you're really trying to facilitate adaptive responses, and you're promoting change. If you're down here, you're trying to maintain current conditions. So if we take a resistance strategy for protecting forest, that means let's look for refugia. Let's try to understand where areas are going to stay cold enough and the conditions are going to stay favorable enough that we can protect things like spruce fir forest or northern hardwood forest. Because it's resistance, we are trying to maintain current species composition. We're trying to prevent change. So when it comes to managing those forests or harvesting in those forests, we might want to pay attention to what's coming up underneath. If there's more beech, birch, basswood, sugar maple in the understory, opening up the canopy may not be a bad thing. It may release that next generation so that now you have a whole new generation that can perhaps persist for hundreds of years. But if the understory is oaks and hickories, if you open up the canopy, you're going to promote change. So if your goal is not to change, you may want to be very careful about how much you open up the canopy. So it talks about how forest stewardship or forest management or forest harvesting can be designed in a way to try to resist some of the changes that might otherwise occur. Now, that's assuming that that's what your objective is, that that's your strategy. Try to reduce drought and fire risk. So you might look to try to promote species that are going to be more resistant, or maybe managed so that it's not so thick that you're going to get a particularly hot fire if there is fire. And then where you have overstory trees, pay particular attention to them. Because even if there's a fire, if the big, old, mature trees survive, then much of that forest stand is going to be able to be retained relatively unchanged. Same thing with invasive species and disease. See if you can reduce your risk and make sure the overstory trees have enough room, have enough water, have enough sunlight, so that they can actually survive an infestation if it happens. Ice loading. Now, if you're out there managing your own woodlot, one thing that might be useful to know is that where you have V-shaped junctions or crotches in the tree, those are very vulnerable to splitting. Whereas if they're more U-shaped, they're stronger. And so if you're going to thin trees to try to promote better growth than some of the others, you might selectively remove trees that have the vulnerability, because we're going to have more ice storms. And so there's going to be more damage as limbs break and as trees split. And then if you do have an ice storm, if you do have an infestation of some kind, if you do have drought, and you have some trees that survived it pretty well, well, let's maintain those trees. Those individual trees may be genetically different than others. They may have an advantage. Or it may be that they're in growing conditions that allow them to persist. Either way, let's keep them going, because they've already shown that they can persist through difficult times. Moving on, let's talk about resilience. So this is a strategy where we know there are going to be impacts. How do we bounce back from them most effectively? So increasing forest heterogeneity or diversity is a key strategy to try to improve resilience in forests. So that means a diversity of species in the forest, a diversity of age and size classes, a diversity of environmental conditions, so that if there's damage, there's going to be some favorable species that remain that are able to then quickly recover and restore the conditions in that forest. You might favor signature species. So if you're talking about a hemlock ravine ecosystem, well, it wouldn't be a hemlock ravine if there's no hemlock left. So you might manage carefully to try to protect your hemlock. Or if it's a pitch pine or an Atlantic white cedar swamp, these are basically ecosystems that are named for a particularly important dominant species within that system. You can try to emulate some of the natural processes that provide gaps in the canopy that promote regeneration. So a lot of our forests are even aged. They basically all started growing after farmers abandoned this land and moved out west. And so we don't really have a lot of forests with really old trees in it. And some of those big top-heavy trees are the ones that get blown over during storms. So you don't get as many gaps in the canopy now as we might have expected if we were dealing with a pristine forest. So sometimes management can try to emulate some of those characteristics so that you get patches of sunlight coming in that promote undergrowth, which creates some advanced regeneration that can be available if there's some kind of a storm or a fire to then pick up where the other ones left off. And then introduce heterogeneity in environments and resources, and provide opportunities maybe for future adapted species. So it may be that southern species are showing up. Maybe you might want to try to encourage them along, because 50 years, 100 years from now, our conditions are going to be more suitable for those species than some of the more northern ones. And so those are the ones that are going to respond best after some kind of a disturbance. And then the third strategy is transition. And so for transition, we're assuming change. We're actually trying to guide change to some degree. So assisted migration is sometimes a controversial thing, but there are sort of more palatable versions of it and those that are more controversial. The most palatable one is what's called assisted population expansion. And that's where if you have a species that's on the northern edge of its range, but it's already present, you try to promote it so that it can spread, because it's probably going to be an important species years from now. You have assisted range expansion. And so that might be where you have species that's at the edge of its range, and what you want to do is produce conditions so that it can continue moving north and become a presence in other forests nearby. So think of this as like infilling around some of the early ones, and think of this as expansion. So Whately and Westhampton have probably the most northern stands of tulip poplar that we're aware of in Massachusetts. But probably 100 years from now, that'll be further north. And so how do we encourage tulip poplar to be an important tree going forward? Assisted species migration is when you might say, okay, we're going to take this species, we're going to plant it 50 miles up the road. So it's not moving on its own. You're actually picking it up and moving it yourself. Some people think this is necessary because climate change is moving faster than organisms can move. Others are saying you're playing God and you're monkeying with the system. So that's the one that's the most controversial, but it's certainly worth thinking about. We might have to think about species substitutions. So where you have hemlock ravines, but because of hemlock woolly adelgid and other changes due to climate change, you don't expect it's going to survive. So if you don't have that dense shade, can you maintain your cold water streams? Can you maintain brook trout populations? Well, maybe you need some other kind of an evergreen. Maybe it's not native, but as long as it's not invasive, could you substitute that for hemlock? It's being talked about. Nobody has a good candidate species yet. But this is something that climate change is doing, is it's making us think about conservation in ways that seem antithetical to the way we grew up thinking about conservation. So another easy thing to do is sort of maintain seed sources for future expansion. So in that tulip poplar stand in Whately, which was recently purchased by Kestrel Land Trust, thankfully, they're big trees. These are really good-sized trees, mature trees, seed-bearing trees. Making sure that those trees are still available to spread seed north is a way of maintaining the ability for that species to adjust with the change in climate. All right, I'm going to shift. I'm near the end, so just hang with me. I'm going to talk about streams, and then I'm going to wrap up. But I mentioned cold water streams, and cold water streams are one of those vulnerable ecosystems because as air temperatures increase, water temperatures will increase too. And there are species like brook trout and slimy sculpins and certain crayfish and salamanders that require cold water. And the amount of habitat for them is undoubtedly going to shrink because of global warming and climate change. So the question is, can we maintain enough habitat to keep them a part of our biodiversity in Massachusetts? So, like I said, brook trout are a fairly charismatic species that people can identify with, but there are other species that live in these cold water streams as well. This is the spring salamander. And in a study that was done cooperatively between USGS, US Geological Survey, and Mass Wildlife, this is a distribution of places where brook trout occur now. And you can see all the different places where field surveys have documented the presence of brook trout. But then when we model temperature change in those to see which of those areas are likely to support them in the future, with just a 2-degree increase in water temperature, look at how many of those blue dots turn red. So the blue dots are the places where they are likely to persist. The red dots, the places where they're likely to disappear. With a 4-degree change, it's even worse. So here again, the concept of refugia comes in. Can we identify those stream segments where we're likely to maintain cool enough temperatures that we should make that a priority for conservation to make sure that we have brook trout into the future, along with all those other species that belong in cold water systems? So, strategies: identify cold water refugia and assess its viability to know whether it's worth making it a priority for conservation. Protect the land associated with those refugia. Restore riparian forests, so those are the forests right up along the banks, so that it provides shade. It might actually be able to restore some colder temperatures, or at least maintain them in the face of climate change. We want to disconnect stormwater. And so the way to imagine this is it's in the heart of summer. It's a 95-degree day, of which we're going to have a lot more in the future than we have in the past. Sunny day, you got a parking lot. it's really hot. A thunderstorm comes in and dumps half an inch of water on that parking lot. It runs off the parking lot and right into your cold water stream. What's that do to the water temperature in the stream? So we may have to look at those opportunities where we have cold water streams and say, we need to separate out this stormwater output. We need to have a place for the water to sit and infiltrate into the ground and cool off and not go directly into the brook. But that's something we can do. We can do stuff to try to make it more likely that these systems will persist. Dam removals have two benefits. It actually reduces temperature in the streams downstream most of the time, because that big open body of water fully exposed to the sun collects a lot of energy and warms the water. But also removing dams helps connect populations so that you can maintain viable populations even if they're scattered in isolated patches throughout the stream network. Another connectivity related action we can do is replace culverts and make sure that our culverts actually are able to pass fish and other organisms that need to swim in order to get from one side of the road to another. So there is this concept in biology of metapopulations and metapopulation dynamics. And a metapopulation is a regional population made up of a number of local populations. And as you have movement of individuals from one local population to another, you can actually supplement a population that's failing because it doesn't have enough reproduction to sustain itself. You can maintain healthy genetics in these otherwise small and isolated populations by an infusion of genes that come when one individual comes from one population and joins another. And you have a mechanism for recolonizing areas where an extinction event actually occurs. So if you lose a population, as long as the landscape allows the movement of individuals to reach that vacant habitat, you have the opportunity to reestablish a new population in the same place. So let me illustrate that with this little animation where, assuming that the brook trout used to occupy this entire stream network, but because of climate change, it's now got refugia, and it lives in these refugia in the upper tributaries. Now, the habitat is smaller and more isolated, so they're more vulnerable to extinction events due to genetics, due to what we call stochastic events or random events, or catastrophes. So one way that you can improve the conditions is if you have movement among these various individual populations so that you can supplement another population that may be failing, so that you can have gene flow that maintains more healthy genetic dynamics. And then you also have a mechanism for recolonizing areas after extinction events. So if we have a drought, and because of that drought, we lose the populations in these tributaries, it doesn't mean that that's done forever. Because the natural process by which animals move through the landscape allow for the opportunity to reestablish populations and then use them as stepping stones to colonize other areas where there may be vacant habitat. But when we put in roads, we know that dams are important barriers. What's been overlooked for many years is the extent to which culverts are barriers to fish trying to get upstream. So when we put in roads and we put in culverts, if those culverts block the fish passage, then we basically short-circuited our ability to recolonize habitats after an extinction event. So these animals are still trying to move, but they're being blocked. So instead of putting in the same old pipe that was there before that didn't allow fish passage, when it's time to replace a culvert, you can design something like this. This is called a stream simulation culvert. It's an open bottom arch where you build a stream bed inside it, and this can allow free passage of not just fish, but other species that don't swim or don't swim as well as brook trout. And so this is a culvert replacement project that occurred in my town in Whately on a brook called Mitchell Brook. And then lastly, I talked earlier about the extremes that we're likely to get in terms of flow in our streams. And we've already experienced some of that already. This is a picture of the Ipswich River not that long ago, and it happened again last year. The entire river went dry. Not very good for the ecology of the river. Then you have Tropical Storms Irene, and here's the Bridge of Flowers in Shelburne Falls. I just could not believe this photograph when I saw it in the video that they posted, that water had gotten up that high. Now, we know these are dangerous situations. And nobody would say, yeah, we shouldn't be paying attention to these extreme storms. But it's not just the threat to public health and safety and to property and to infrastructure. When these storms come through, they ravage these streams. They scour them out in ways that are not natural. And in Vermont, I've had stream ecologists tell me that their streams never recover. They're always in this state of recovery because before they're fully recovered, another storm comes and scours them out and destabilizes them again. So we need to try to reduce the damaging effect of these high flow events, and we need to try to maintain base flow so that we don't have streams and rivers drying up during drier conditions. So the concept here is what we call slow the flow. Store more water in the upper watershed to reduce storm impacts and maintain base flow during dry periods. And the strategies are to restore net channel complexity and sinuosity. That means like adding wood to streams, accommodate beavers because their dams hold water back and store water in the upper parts of watersheds, reduce impervious surfaces, reconnect streams to their floodplains so that they can spread the water out and store it there. Wetland creation, create new wetlands that can also store water. And in urban and more developed areas, rain gardens and other stormwater management systems that hold the water back and slow it down as it moves through the system. So the Trout Unlimited chapter here in the Northeast is actually doing active management of streams by putting wood in the streams. So they're actually cutting down trees and plunking them in, and they're strategically locking them into place so that they can create conditions that used to occur in our streams when we had bigger trees. You know, when big trees fall into a stream, it stays there for a long time, and it slows water down, and it creates habitat. And so by rewooding streams, you can both enhance the habitat, the in-stream habitat for brook trout and other species, and also hold some of the water back that's flowing downstream. You say, yeah, but how much water can you hold back with a log? With a log, not that much. With lots of logs in lots of streams spread out all over the landscape, yeah, it adds up. It makes a difference. So the final thing is just where can you go to get more information? The state of Massachusetts, to its credit, and unusual in this country because it has a Republican governor and a Democratic legislature, takes climate change very seriously. And they've done an enormous amount to try to address it from a mitigation point of view and an adaptation point of view. And so this website is a state website called Resilient Mass. So it's resilientma.org. And it has lots and lots of information. It's a clearinghouse for information. But it also includes lots of data from the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center about what you can expect for conditions in the future. There's another website called the Massachusetts Wildlife Climate Action Tool. It's climateactiontool.org. And this is a site that provides a lot of information about climate change and some case studies about what people are doing about it. It talks about vulnerability of ecosystems and species. It shares vulnerability assessments that have been done. And it also has conservation actions that can be taken to try to adapt and protect ecosystems and species in the face of climate change. The U.S. Forest Service has the Climate Change Atlas. So those distributions that I showed you for sugar maple and for hemlock and for black-throated green warbler, you can find them on this website. That's the URL. And so you can look at different species of trees, different species of birds, and look at their current distribution and what's projected for the future. And then this is a very complicated picture, but this is an interesting network. It's the Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Network. And this is for trying to understand which species we're most vulnerable to and try to prepare for them before they get here. And so you can go to this. This was put together by a couple of my colleagues at UMASS. and you can learn about some of the invasive species that are already in the state, but also ones that could arrive sometime in the future because of climate change. And then lastly, I've mentioned a couple times the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. They're doing exceptionally good work. They're doing a lot of science. They have a lot of different projects. You can go to their website and find out about some of the projects they do, including this project about invasive species and climate change. And I encourage you to go browse that site and see what additional information you might learn from that. And with that, I'll close. I know I've talked for much longer than I was supposed to, but I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.